I don't think I need to introduce you, do I? You're not a stranger. Certainly not on the podcast and not even to the audience.
There will be people who will see the first time, I hope.
Everybody knows, yeah, definitely. So, but I'm sure they can go ahead and Google you. So, but everybody knows Abubakar Suleiman, and it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
So I'll start here. Something that I've heard you say uh, over the last couple of months, possibly years, regards the economy and how it works. So there's this particular line that I like very much, which is that we have to create before we regulate. Um, what do you think is the barrier to people like conceptually grasping that both at the policy level and even at the implementation level? The fact that we first need to, particularly one challenge that I see is there's always the pressure, the urgency to distribute. Sometimes things that are finite, sometimes things that are even not non-existent, that have not been created yet. So why is it difficult for us to still grasp the fact that where we are and as an economy, we still need to create a lot of wealth, a lot of resources, a lot of infrastructure, a lot of other things that will make us have the quality of life that we desire as Nigerians?
Okay, so that's an interesting question, and it's one that I'm not sure that I have figured it all out, but the aspect of it that I'm very confident I understand. Um, I will start with the big one, which is the irony, is that the same 4-year tenure that is supposed to be one of the strengths of democracy, that opportunity for us to reset if we don't like what we got, has also become an albatross. Because if you think about it, to create is to sacrifice, is to defer consumption. And therefore, if I came in for a 4-year tenure setting, what are the chances that I want to spend that 4 years doing work that nobody can see the outcome? Right? So there's an element of that which is you've got this very short period of time, and therefore between trying to plant and to reap, there's really very little time. And I think from a political perspective, that is why it's so difficult for them to take longer term plan. And it's also why it's so difficult for them to spend their time and resources and accelerating the economic growth without necessarily beginning to extract value, you know, either in the forms of taxes or sometimes in more direct forms. So there is that. It is ironic, but it's just what it is. But the second part where I think we could pay a bit more attention is there's a sense of entitlement, and it comes from observing other countries that are matured, where the citizens are entitled to certain services because they've built the framework for it. And we think we should be there. And therefore, our generation, and potentially the generation before us, have a sense that the society should give them certain things, which is a fair ask if the society has the capacity to deliver those things. But it doesn't. The society cannot give me this sort of transport infrastructure that I need because it hasn't been built. The society cannot give us the quality of education that we want for the number of people that want it because again we haven't built all of that. That entitlement unfortunately has meant that we're not thinking a lot about putting into the society first. We think it is ready for harvesting, maybe because those who came before us were able to, access that level of service from society, access that quality of education from the university and not have to pay for it. In many cases, come out of school and immediately get a job. But that was only possible because we were offering it to very few people. It would not be possible if you were trying to offer university admission, for instance, to 2 million people. Even at 500,000, we're struggling. So there is that aspect of it, which is some sort of entitlement. And how do we convince people that we are the generation that needs to make the investment before the generation after us can then have that entitlement and it to be realistic? But right now, it's not realistic to expect that much from society. But ultimately, the government has to sacrifice for growth to happen. The government has to defer certain lines of consumption. Not just the people, but the government. The government is not about to do that, especially if you've come into power with a lot of promises. And of course, successful politicians are increasingly more populist, and that puts them under pressure to deliver short term. And that then makes it very difficult for them to invest. Finally, I hold the view that we do not have enough framework, first and foremost, to evaluate the performance of regulators. At least politicians get to face judgment every 4 years.
Yeah.
But with regulators, there's very little you can do. The only thing that matters is whether those who appoint them are happy with them, not whether or not the industry that they oversee or supervise are doing well. So there is no framework for evaluating the performance of regulators and for holding them accountable. That's a very dangerous thing. And until we start to see regulators primarily as a part of the industry they regulate, and that their progress or their success is a function of how successful that industry is, what we have are just people who have only one tool, which are just brakes, and they keep applying it all the time. So to my mind, the relationship between the businesses and the regulator needs to be reevaluated. And if we don't fix that, I doubt that we're going to see the kind of growth that we're looking for.
So a bit of a twofold follow-up to that. One is that, do you think that over the decades, this is also due to quote unquote the resource cost problem? Because you spoke about the population. There was a time when it seemed that there was more than enough to go around. We have these resources that's internationally priced, that the sovereign is not really spending. There are private investors, IOCs or whatever, are mining it. You collect and then you spend on this. So is this part of the incentive problems that come from having a resource-dependent economy? Then secondly, what you spoke about democracy. Certainly, I want Nigeria to remain a democracy. I think it's deserved for a country as complex and multifaceted as ours. But do you think that the way we do politics, especially at a platform of political parties and various other intermediaries, it's because there isn't enough ideology, whereas the party then becomes the platform for continuity in terms of vision and ultimately what you execute, such that, it doesn't matter if this particular person couldn't get it done, the next guy can simply continue, along those lines.
Okay, before we discuss the resource cost and how it might have affected our entitlement mentality, I think I'd like to start with the ideology and whether or not that is the effect. Ideology is a very sophisticated concept. It's not the most basic thing. You don't, default into understanding ideology and committing to it. And therefore, political ideology is a function of an educated elite and to some extent an educated society. I always go back to what I believe is where we missed it. In countries like Sweden, I believe they had universal free education for about a century before universal adult suffrage. So what that means is that a large segment of the population had an understanding of the democratic process and how it worked and their rights before they could vote. We reversed that. We inverted it such that people had universal adult suffrage even when they had absolutely no idea how the political system worked or the consequences of the decisions that they make. So you're not going to have an ideology-led society without first educating the people. People need to understand the ideology that they're standing by. Otherwise, you'd end up with ideologies that are, in effect, influenced primarily by religious or ethnic exposure, which is the areas where people feel very confident. They're very confident about their identity and they're very confident about their faith. And so you can build around that. But if you want political ideology that are based on the economic system that we want to run, then we're not that confident about how that works. So I would say the solution lies in still educating the populace, which goes back to the issue of how the democratic process, while it is highly desirable, needs some rethinking. Because where a society is poor, the easiest way to convince them to vote for you is to offer populist ideas that you cannot deliver on.
Mm.
And that's why we've seen a lot of people who have won elections, that people who have made promises that make absolutely zero economic sense, but the population they are speaking to do not understand that, and so they support it. So we need to rethink democracy. How do we make sure that the people who contribute to a democratic decision-making process, starting with the voters all the way to the president, be a better framework to guide us and to prevent more extreme outcomes. There are examples about how in some society you vote in your local elections, right? And then those that you voted for will then participate in, voting upward for the next layer, the next level. And that is to prevent you from asking me to make decisions about complex ideas. Brexit is a very good example of the population being asked to make a decision that is so complex that they couldn't possibly have understood what they were voting on. And there are many such decisions that have been made in the political circle. So there is that, right? There is that about democracy. Now, do we have a resource cost? I like to say, like everyone else, that that's part of the problem, but I see a deeper problem. The first problem we have is that even if you've got resources and you're going to invest or spend it, if there's an efficiency of spending, meaning that every dollar that you spend then generates $1.5 or $2 worth of value, then I think we would have created an economy that would have grown and have been able to replace oil as those resources ran out. The problem was that there was a very poor quality of spending that came out of that. So irrespective of what else you think, if we spend the money in such a way that they genuinely then deliver outcomes that are equivalent at the minimum to the money that was spent, we would have had economic growth. The other point is that we built a society that could cater to a very limited number of people, not dissimilar from colonialism. So the transition from colonial rule to a democratic process did not go through any point where we dismantle the economic system that
was built on that.
Exactly. So we still continue to run the same economic system, we run the same elite system, we run the same limited approach system. And so it looked like a lot of resources when you were providing for 1% or 2% of the society.
Mm-hmm.
I keep reminding people that when you go back to the data, in 1970, the population was about 57.7 million, and we had less than 20,000 people in tertiary institution. Of course, it's going to look like a high quality of life for those few people that were there, because they were effectively at the top of that food chain. Now we have 2.3 million people. It's a lot of growth, right? In 50 years, we've seen
230 million.
Exactly, 230 million people. With that number of people, no, we have 2.3 million people in universities.
Oh yeah, okay, sorry.
Now, we do need to have, to my mind, at least 10% of our population in institutions of higher learning. That's the sort of number we need to achieve industrialization. Now we're at 1%. And we're already out of resources, which is why I argue strongly for private sector funded or private sector model for funding tertiary institution, with room for grants and room for scholarships and room for subsidies in terms of the funding cost. But the government does not at this point have resources for the number of people who deserve to have access to education. So therefore, it becomes unfair when we limit access by giving those resources to a few people, and we run a model that makes it impossible for the alternative sources of capital to open up. So I do feel very strongly that we need to expand NEL Fund. It's a very good initiative. We need to get to a point where the universities also become accountable, because the students are paying for education, so the student can demand something. At this point, the government pays for education, the students have really no impact or no capacity to ask for value for money. We change that once I'm taking a loan to pay for my education, and I can go with my feet. I can decide to go to another school because obviously you are not offering the quality of education that I want. So yes, it's not just the resource cost. It is the fact that We offered services to very few people, and we ignored the vast majority of our people who were at that time in rural areas. Also the fact that we did not change the economic model to account for the fact that we must now take care of all of our people rather than the few who effectively took over from the colonial system.
So, I mean, at some point we'll get the human capital question, but I sort of want to go back to something you said in the first question, which was regulators and the framework for evaluating them, their performance and how they deliver. There's something I have noticed, and you seem like the ideal person to talk about this. The framework for engagement between government and the private sector. What should it look like, and how should we better institutionalize it? Because what I see, fine, Nigeria may not be as notorious as the Indian license Raj, but you certainly have some very uncomfortable situations where you are here right now, we're talking. I'm aware actually of some situations 2, 3 years ago where your opinion on the podcast right now might lead the regulator to start threatening your banking license. And so many other funny experiences like that where some people arrogate certain powers to themselves without care for the systemic distortion that causes and the signal it sends to the market, to the sector, to the economy writ large. And I've always felt businesses all over the world, businesses engage, but it seemed to be highly personalized in Nigeria. Although Musk and Trump are radically defining that and how that means nobody now. So it's highly personalized, it is highly unstable. It depends on the mood or the personality of the person who is in charge. And it just seems like the private sector sometimes just have to take it on the chin and, ride it out. And I think that affects the expectations, the stability that businesses, investors need for a growing economy and so how do we better institutionalize the relationship between because right now it's just a very fertile arrangement for state capture.
Yeah, this is probably the most difficult question of the day. I doubt that you're going to be able to come up with one that would be more difficult to answer. And since we are being honest, I'm going to try and give it a shot. Right? I think the first problem you face in terms of the power of the regulator and the relationship that evolves between the regulator and the operator is that they are appointees of political office holders. Right, completely appointees of political office holders. There is no part of the process, for instance, that moderates that ability or power of the office holder to appoint anyone. And in many cases, they've appointed people who have very limited understanding of the sector or who, I would say, were not the stars in the industry that they now regulate. I would expect one of the better ones, if I'm going to pick someone from an industry to become a regulator, it's going to be one of those that actually performed and did very well and showed real understanding. And so I'm not necessarily for abrogating that power per se, but I think there should be a process. That means that by the time the political office holder is appointing someone, there's certain things that are guaranteed to have happened already. Whether or not it is one in which, for instance, there is an industry level of self-evaluation, right? So, good example, in the accounting service sector, you've got to be a chartered accountant, right? There's some level of industry way of ensuring that at the minimum we are certain that you have certain skill sets. Or you could be a fellow of the institute, right? In banking, you could be a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Bankers. These are industry level of performance or capability evaluation that are helpful, right? I'm not saying we should copy that. It's just an example of how if you are an office holder and you have to choose a chartered accountant to hold an office, at the minimum, we have set a basic standard for that, right? And you could then have other things like some level of industry self-regulation and some kind of good standing certificate, right? If an industry cannot say, for instance, that you have a certain level of good standing, then you cannot be appointed. That's one example of how to moderate what then sometimes become the abuse of the power to appoint. The second part of it is that I think a lot more, if you want a more collaborative regulator-operator relationship, then there should be in the form of a board that's a bit more powerful than they tend to be these days. Some kind of board that's a combination of both government appointed and sector appointed members that oversee the regulator. Because believe me, if we do not find that balance, we will continue to struggle to create the environment for growth. Right? It could be set, I mean, it can be defined, there can be a lot of restriction as to who can be on that board, but the regulator must be accountable or answerable to someone that is not just a set of government appointees, which in this level have tended to be ineffective. And I think the final layer, and the most important one, is if you want your regulator to be effective, then you must set clear objectives, and those objectives must include the growth of the industry that they're regulating. You cannot have an objective that is just compliance, because the best way to achieve 100% compliance is 0% activity, right? So what tends to happen is, as you try to drive compliance, you keep pushing that level of growth. You need to be able to set growth objectives. Say, when you are appointed, this is the level of growth we have, this is the level of growth we expect you to deliver. That way, there is a two-way conversation between the regulator and the industry. One is, what do I need to give you so that you can grow? And then the second part is, what do I need to do so that you can comply? Right. So as opposed to this level of, all we're talking about is you're not compliant, the threats, and in a way it ends up killing businesses.
I know you wanted to keep it short, but allow me to spend some time a little bit on that question going further. Another thing I think about is institutional memory. We've been a democracy since 1999, at least in this phase. Certainly someone like me or people like me can remember certain periods of time where you can point to certain agencies or institutions that were green shoots doing better under a particular person or personality, which then radically degrades, like almost immediately in the next cycle. So maybe I'm not casting aspersions here, but people will tell you how we NAFDAC was under Dora Akunyili and, this or that. A good example is telecoms, right? We had this nice idea to kickstart this industry, and I recall vividly that right from the early days, there were calls for price control. And even before this industry got started by, certain interest groups, And I also recall that it was almost single-handedly a fight with the first DG of the NCC and almost everybody else is saying, oh, please, let's not be in a hurry. The prices will come down. Let's focus on competition. And you imagine a scenario where if it had been somebody else who did not understand that is how supply works, right? We could have killed an industry that has brought billions of dollars to the economy and jobs in its infancy. So how do we preserve institutional memory?
I don't know that our institutions are as weak as we imagine. I think we underestimate how powerful our institutions can be when there's alignment. I think more than being weak institutions, we have weak alignment between the individuals that are responsible for operating the institutions and the outcomes that we would like to see. So I would start with alignment. What is it that we measure the institution by? And therefore, by implication, those who run the institution. if you set the right objectives for them, and we are firm in ensuring that we enforce um, some kind of outcomes, we enforce some kind of compliance with those objectives, what you will see, the behavior will change. I think there's a bigger problem with lack of alignment, because irrespective of how strong an institution is, it doesn't drive itself. It takes an individual or individuals to drive it and make it work. And if those individuals are not motivated, if they are not aligned with your objective, nothing gets done. A strong institution can be static. It is strong, but it's going nowhere. Right. So I think we should spend some time and think about alignment. I give one of the examples that I don't think we talk about often enough is how much do we pay a Nigerian policeman? Right. They're so poorly paid to risk their life that you can guarantee many of them will lose their ways. It's just a certain human nature. An alignment would be, oh, we're going to try and pay you living wages and improve your quality of life. Oh, by the way, if we achieve this level of security in the society, you will get something more. So they're motivated to keep crime down, to contain crime, to solve for crime. Today they are motivated to stay alive. Right? And this is true of so many other government institutions where the alignment is weak. The reward system is poor, but the alignment is weak. Political office holders, they are very poorly paid. But guess what? Every time they travel, they get paid a certain amount of money called DTA, daily travel allowance, which is a far higher amount than what they would have earned from what they get paid. So guess what they're doing? They're traveling at every excuse. Why do you think that every major event offshore will fully overrepresented? Precisely because every single person who makes it on that trip can legitimately earn money. Even those who are not unethical understand that the only way they can pay their bills is to travel. Right? Alignment is the powerful thing, and it is lacking in our government. I would rather you pay a minister $500,000 a year or $1 million a year so that they don't need to run around trying to make ends meet, because they also have political obligations that cost money. Right? So yes, institutional memory. You'd be amazed at how much institutional memory we have. We just don't have any motivation to work with it. Right? But the other comment, and to sort of circle back to the conversation around regulators, I think the regulatory tenure for a lot of the agencies need to go beyond the tenure of the person appointing them. I think it's important that we don't have 500 positions to be filled by a president whenever he resumes. It creates a huge amount of distraction for him, and these are all appointments that are politically juicy, if you will. And so there's a lot of effort at balancing interest at the period when he ought to be focused on outcomes from people who are already there and ready to run. Right. So I would ask that the tenure should be disconnected from the electoral cycle, and that it should be extended, because regulation is a lot of experience comes into being a good regulator. Being removed every 4 years doesn't augur well for the industries they regulate.
Do you think we are doing enough? And if not, because that's how I would answer the question, if not, how do we scale things up to a place where we start seeing some impact? So I'm speaking about human capital, precisely education and health. I had a doctor on the show who made the important point that one of the things we don't often talk about is that healthcare is about people. It's not really about the buildings. And yes, those are important. It's not really about the buildings and the beds. Those are important, but we don't train enough people. And of course, when we talk about these things, investments, it costs money. And sometimes the challenge is always, government is limited in resources, because then you have to do this, you have to do that. The budget was just out, and of course, you can see the breakdown on how much we are going to spend on education and healthcare. So what is the funding model, and what are the incentives here for the private sector to feel confident enough to assume some risks?
Okay, so again, one of my favorite quip is let's not optimize obsolescence. I think when it comes to education and healthcare, we're trying to scale things that are already obsolete. We're trying to take systems that were designed for highly formal economies and impose it to an economy that's highly informal, right? I mean, let's take medical care or healthcare as it were. We think that the way to solve for healthcare is to have as many doctors as possible in hospitals that people go to. And I think it's the wrong way to go about it. And the reason is that we already have a really dangerous doctors to patient ratio, and it takes an average of 7 years to train a doctor that can operate independently, and so there is no way we can catch up with that, right? But the question is, what if we reduce the patient ratio? Why does everyone have to see a doctor, right? Maybe a lot of the things that end up in the front of a doctor doesn't need to get to a doctor. Maybe I don't need to train people for 7 years before they can provide some level of healthcare advisory services. So you create a system where you start to catch the diseases at the informal level, because there are a lot of people who have been trained to be able to take basic healthcare data and be able to interpret it. Or you move on and you use telemedicine and you say, okay, let us aggregate all the medical doctors that have got the time to spare, or we move into using AI to augment consultation, and suddenly we need fewer doctors, right? What this means is that I could be spending 6 months training someone who would end up adding far more value than people who spend 7 years, because they prevent diseases. They capture these diseases at their earlier stage because they are readily available, they are next door, and so you could actually, the patients are more likely to seek help, and then we can prevent this from becoming diseases that requires a medical doctor. Right. So my thought is that this informal economy of ours, we must find systems that are adaptable to the informal nature of our people and their culture, first and foremost. And it's only when we evolve from there that we can have formal systems. Same is true of education. I've never liked the idea that you put a kid in school and say for the next 4 years or 6 years or 10 years, all you do is you learn. That's a very, in my view, inefficient way to learn. The better way to learn is to learn and do and learn and do. So when you are out of secondary school, I imagine a situation where I put you to learn for about a year and go into the workplace.
But isn't that what youth service is supposed to be?
No, youth service, you're coming out, very spend 4 years or 5 years doing nothing but learning. You've never had a chance to go to the circle and apply what you've learned, and therefore, in a way, adjust what you will learn. Right? If you've learned something wrong for 4 years, then you come back and then you start to try to figure out how to apply it. That's why we're spending so much money retraining people after they've gone through university. But imagine if you were to spend a year learning, and then you get into the workplace, you apply some of the things you've learned, you acquire social skills, you're mentored, you interact with the product or the customers, and then when you go back to learn the second year, you are learning with different context and a different perspective, and you are learning in a more practical way.
So something like psychical internships.
My view is that we actually need to integrate work and learning into the same space. I think this idea of a space for learning and a place for working, it's very ineffective. Unless you are in full academia and you're doing research and all of that, the average person going through school whose ultimate destination is a workplace ought to be placed in a workplace as quickly as possible. In other words, we're evolving this concept of a micro campus, where every workplace is a micro campus, because you are learning there and interacting there. And of course, in between, thanks to technology, we now have distant learning and online universities. So you can do a lot of the theoretical learning online and by yourself, and with some level of supervision by the people you work with. Right. So I'm, for example, an adjunct professor, and what I do is I use part of my spare time to teach. Why can't I do that in my workplace? Right? Integrate that using technology globally, and you can have people all over the workplaces learning and at the same time practicing what they're learning. That makes it a lot cheaper. In fact, it gets to a point where the workplace ends up paying for your education, right? In the hope that when you graduate, you'll continue to work for them, and effectively it pays out because they are almost customizing talent to their need. That the people that have spent 3 to 4 years interning with them while learning are so kitted to excel in their company that they will most likely employ them, and in that way it pays for itself. So it's this idea of let's not take existing systems because they worked elsewhere at a different time and try to scale it here. I think we need to step back and ask, what do we need to do differently? I think we can put 2 million, additional 2 million students in school by simply turning all of our workplaces into learning spaces and using technology to integrate them with the campuses. So for instance, we've got a model where we would be able to train 4 times as many doctors, because the doctors would only spend 3 months on a campus and they'll spend the remaining 9 months in a teaching hospital or a specialist hospital, right? And then after that, they go back again for another 3 months of intensive theoretical learning and experiment and lab work, and then they go back to the hospital. And this has been approved by all the agencies that are responsible for this. So we would see this form of learning that allows us to obviously produce more by just adapting to our own environment.
Mm. Do you think that businesses should get involved in politics? And if so, in what form?
The question is, what would a business bring into politics, right? You have to be clear about what you're bringing in. I think people who work in private sector should be involved in politics. I think anyone who lives and is governed by the politicians should be involved in politics. Some of them would contest election, some of them would simply vote, some of them would organize, some of them would contribute or donate, but everyone should be involved. I think we should encourage every individual. I actually believe that we should make voting mandatory.
Okay.
Because what has happened now is that the people who have tended to come out when voting is not mandatory are those who can be induced. A lot of those who are better informed have opted to stay out, right? But if we make it mandatory to change the ratio a bit, we'll see a lot more people who understand what is really going to participate in politics, and hopefully we'll start to influence everyone who is voting, right? So that's.
I don't think that currently the system has the incentive to do that, because then if we make voting mandatory, it then creates a lot of logistical problems that perhaps the system is not designed.
Well, I think the system would evolve to solve the what needs to be solved. If we do not give it that challenge, the system is not going to evolve to solve a non-existent challenge, right? We need the people who are eligible to vote, right?
Yeah, I agree with you. It's just that because, personally, I see some of the numbers, especially in our state elections. I see some of the numbers of voters relative to the population of the states, and they are frankly embarrassed.
But that needs to change. If it doesn't change, the political process is not going to mature. I think part of the way to make that change is to force people to vote, right? If we do that, it forces engagement. So you don't even need the businesses to participate in politics if the people participate at the level that they ought to participate. Because imagine if everyone in an office is going to vote, then political conversations become everyday conversation in an office space, whether you are the CEO or not. Everybody participates in that conversation. And because I have to vote anyway, right, compels me to hopefully try and convince people to vote the way I would vote. So it's no longer a question of will vote count. It now becomes a question of how do you vote? How do I get you to vote in a way that it gives me the outcome that I think is best for society? So
I get you. But my question is more telegraphed towards things around civil rights. So for example, as you are currently, you are my banker. Not personally, but the institution with which you represent and are associated. So we've had real life examples of this, but let's say hypothetically I see something that your regulator finds politically offensive, and he then orders you to put PNP on my account, not because I committed fraud or anything, but because maybe I insulted the person at the top on my podcast or on social media or something. To what extent are you constitutionally or legally obligated to defend my right as your customer or obey your regulator?
I think what you've pointed out is whether or not we have rule of law, and whether or not we can enforce it.
Yeah.
So to that extent, I don't
because people will criticize. People have criticized financial institutions for obeying certain
I don't think
funny court orders.
Court orders are not funny. Court orders are court orders. The way to resolve a court order is to go back to the court, right? I don't see any other solution. If it is a valid court order that has been issued by a court, it is for the, because the moment we start to select what court order to obey and which one is funny, that's chaos, right? No, I don't think I need to participate in politics as an institution to be able to resolve this. See, democracy has to be tested. We have this illusion that democracy is mature and it will do the right thing. It doesn't work that way. We got to test it through the court processes, and sometimes we go back to the National Assembly. We're not testing our democracy. We're not working it. And so it remains, underdeveloped, right? The way to figure out whether or not a court order is funny is to go to the legal system and force the legal system to force an interpretation. The way to resolve a legislation that you think is not consistent either with the interest of the society or with the Constitution is, again, to go back to the court and force the court to interpret the law. We don't do that. There are not many cases in Nigerian court where we are forcing an interpretation of the law.
But practically, like in this situation, whose job is it is to do that? Because certainly you have situations where the person who is the target of are not sufficiently empowered or well positioned.
Unfortunately, the primary person to respond to an injustice is the person that has been unjustly treated. There's the one that has the most motivation to respond. Someone who has not been impacted may have a duty or a sense of justice and may choose to participate in seeking justice, but it must start with the person that has been affected by a court decision or an act that we deem unjust. I cannot, like they say, cry louder than the bereaved, as they say, right? And certainly not a corporate. A corporate has no such mandate or motivation or resources.
I'm with you, but it's just that, like I said, sometimes there are systemic inequalities in the way this thing happens.
And the question is that unique to us? Or has this been the story of every democracy where there are what I will call bugs in the system, right? And how do these bugs get resolved? My point is that there are two ways. Either you use the existing legal process to resolve them, or there is a political movement where the different set of people come on board and then they start to then fix that from the legislative position as well, all the way down to judiciary, right? So again, reform is an all-society thing. Everybody has a role to play. If the matter is so significant that affects sufficient number of people, then it can affect political outcomes. And therefore, either the existing politicians will respond to try and address the problem, or they will lose the election because the significant number of people will vote against them. The democratic process is not the easiest of processes, right? It is messy, it is slow, it is frustrating, but it's the best we've got.
Over the next couple of years, say 5, 10 years down the line, I know that we'll be thinking and talking about this maybe in different political circumstances. But what are the changes, short, medium, long-term changes you would like to see in terms of how the economy matures and evolves going forward?
I think the most impactful thing that I once said to a couple of young people who were asking me about whether or not they have been fairly treated by the country, and my response to them was that the most impactful thing you can do is for 10 million young people to join a political party today, irrespective of which party you join. That you cannot have a powerful tool, your number, and you have your ability to organize because you have social media and technology, and you, to my mind, are aware and then not use that tool, right? So the most powerful thing that young people can do today is to actively participate in politics beyond voting on election day, right? That's the one thing to say. And I think it's important because it sets the foundation for how the economy can transform. The second most important thing that can happen for us today is for us to recognize and activate a plan to hold the subsovereign accountable for the outcome we get in our society. Far too often we think that the federal government is the agency that can deliver the most change in people's lives. While they have the capacity to orchestrate a large body of people to move forward, the changes that will affect people's lives the most will happen at the sub-sovereign. The roads that have the highest economic value is not the coastal highway that will take 5 or 10 years to build. It is one access route to some agricultural community that can be built in 3 months. The investment that will affect healthcare the most is not some sophisticated specialist hospital that is going to be built in Abuja. It is a local borehole that will change how people access drinking water. And because of that, improved sanitation can massively improve the healthcare of the community. But we constantly keep going after this, we're looking for almost a miracle solution. We've come to believe that there is someone who can turn a lever somewhere and our lives will change. So we don't participate in local government politics. We don't really participate in state elections unless, there is some, connection to the federal outcome, right? So that's the problem. And therefore, we are not getting the developmental impact of state governance. That is really where it sits. But what should we do? I think fixing the relationship between the regulator and the operator is so critical. And it should start with sectors where the operator and regulator's roles are convoluted. So in the oil and gas industry, for instance, we've got an entity that is both regulating and operating.
Mm-hmm.
You can rest assured that industry is not going anywhere. Mm-hmm. There will be very clear demarcation between the role of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation as a regulator and its role as an operator. My preference is for them to privatize the operatorship and focus on the regulatorship. Mm-hmm. And to do it based on our earlier conversations about a more balanced model where outcomes, industrial outcomes, are the primary definition of performance of the regulator. Right? If we can do that, that would be significant. And if we achieve that, the second thing, and I think this is something that people fail to understand how important it is, we must communicate certainty of policy. What I mean by certainty of policy is that whatever we have committed to as a policy can be improved upon, can be amended, but cannot be reversed. Reversals of policy is not just about the policies itself, it's about the mindset that nothing we tell you is final. An investor needs to know that whatever we've said is final. Mm-hmm. And that they need to know that they will be given time if things are going to change so that they can respond to it. That's what we need to see the capital flow that needs to come into the industry. We also need to establish that the reforms we've seen in markets, especially electricity markets and the oil and gas or petroleum sector, as well as the currency market, are permanent reforms, that they are not a function of the individual who is currently overseeing them. All right? That needs to be made very clear. And it needs to be some kind of, not just a elite consensus, that's a broad elite consensus. Amongst the politicians themselves, there has to be some level of understanding that irrespective of who is in power, certain things are not negotiable. And part of that is markets needs to exist. Why do we need markets? Because we have a scarcity problem. And the only way you can attract the resources you need is to play on the terms of those who will bring in those resources. And I rest assured that nobody is bringing in capital into a market where they are not certain that they're going to have price discovery or they're going to have liquidity. But I think these are things that are policy-based and could have fundamental impact on how we transform our society. But I also feel like we need to do a lot more proof of concept investment. So the Lekki Deep Sea Port, for instance, I like to think of it as a proof of concept. Because between the Lekki Deep Sea Port and the Dangote Petrochemical Complex and the Lekki Free Trade Zone, right, there is an ecosystem that is evolving there, where if there is a proper handshake, could then create a high-growth industrial area that can then be replicated. So sometimes it's important for us to focus all our resources on proving this, because once it is proven, there are people who will bring in the resources to replicate it. Far too often we are trying to do in this geopolitical zone, or we ought to put in one location, make it work, and then the other 5 geopolitical zones will be funded. But if we do 6 and none of them gets completed, then we never get off the ground.
On that, one quick question before we end on a somewhat more philosophical note. The lack of regulatory and I would say macroeconomic stability, do you think that's a barrier to more risk capital in the economy? I know the startup community complain about that a lot, and I don't want your answer to be based on your experience because I know you are very close and involved in that sector.
I think first and foremost, it's a funnel when it comes to capital. We're not even attracting enough broadly in terms of how much information is out there and how much opportunity people have to see what is possible, right? So first and foremost, we need to really, really widen the funnel. And what is widening the funnel is about storytelling, right? There's got to be a consistent story about Nigeria, where we are going, what we are doing, when it will be done. And that story is to be told not just by the public sector, the government, the president, the Minister of Foreign Affairs or the Minister of Trade and Investment, is to be told by every business person who really encounters a potential investor, local or international. Right? There's going to be that consistent storytelling, but you can't tell a consistent story when the critical elements are not consistent. Right? One of the elements that needs to be consistent, for instance, is your foreign exchange policy and by implication, your exchange rate. Right? There's got to be, it doesn't have to be fixed. It's just got to be consistent because people don't want to put capital in a place where they cannot safely estimate what it will be worth in a year. It's so important. People also don't want to put capital in a place where they cannot safely take it out when they need to take it, irrespective of what the price might be. So we need to create the environment on which the consistent stories will be told. And that's why I say to everyone that cares to listen, that the most important thing that this country has to do is to tackle food inflation. Because once you tackle food inflation, you are way ahead in tackling overall inflation. And the way to tackle food inflation is first and foremost to eliminate the waste and then eliminate the price gouging or the non-value added middlemen. In other words, the people who are in the middle don't create any value and extract a rent, and because of that, the price to market becomes high. Tackling the waste is not just about the post-harvest waste, but also logistics and what it takes to get food from farm to market. That's one. But the second part of it is for the government to understand that the most expensive way for them to fund their budget is easy money. Because first and foremost, that feeds into inflation. And in so doing, first and foremost, first is a tax on the poor, right? A heavy tax on the poor. But it's also a disincentive to invest. So both the investors and the bottom of the pyramid suffer gravely when we fund our budget in such a way that it creates unnecessary inflation, right? So they have to understand that and have to be willing, for instance, to borrow if that's what it takes. Because if you had a single-digit inflation, and by implication your borrowing cost is say 12%, you could borrow twice as much as you borrowed at 24%, and it would be exactly the same economic cost to you. But you would be able to keep the exchange rate stable. You'll be able to keep inflation stable because you've opted for debt. So sometimes when people think, debt is the problem. No, debt is not the problem. The cost of debt is the problem. And the way to tackle cost of debt is to tackle inflation, stabilize your exchange rate, and then you can create an opportunity where people can take long-term bets. Right. So you ask about investment. I think it's really down to first and foremost, what is the story? What story am I buying? And if I'm buying that story, what are the terms of engagement? Right. So it's got to be that deliberate. The regulator itself, we've spoken about it extensively, right? A regulator that is not aligned with an industry outcome that is anchored on growth and prosperity is going to regulate very badly. It's as simple as that. How do we as people demand that our regulators have some level of obligation to industrial expansion or growth, or to output in the industry? There's none of that right now. And we don't talk about this often enough. There are no consequences for disastrous regulation. The only consequence is you get let go, right? You lose the job. But that is already certain, already a given because of this circle, the way we appoint and let people go. Even if you're an excellent regulator, once a new principal comes on board, chances are that you will lose the job anyway. So losing the job for doing a poor job doesn't feel like punishment at all. Even though doing a good job tends to also have similar lifespan as well. So how do we make sure that when regulators take disastrous decisions, there are some level of consequences, some level of, especially personal accountability, where there's evidence that you have acted in bad faith. It doesn't exist today, right? So that I worry more about that than whether or not the regulatory agencies are business aligned. If once you are outcome aligned, once there's incentive, all the other alignment will follow.
Yeah, I think a lot of the propositions and suggestions you've made today are worth taking seriously, especially on the regulator-operator relationship and the general environment that we create. For example, it's not such a good look for us to have created an environment where um, 18 to 20 months down the line, the most powerful financial and monetary regulator at the time is possibly facing jail time today. So I think it's something we need to take seriously. So the final question, which is a bit of a philosophical disagreement I kind of have had over a couple of years, is optimism and hope, and who gets to have it and distribute it in the society. My view is that it's possible for a country to be stuck in a low expectation equilibrium where everybody assumes the worst and they just don't do anything at all to their best. So again, I'm giving you a chance to settle this dispute. Where does optimism come from? Because I see a lot of victim blaming in the sense that, oh, it's always about the people. It is you, the youths, or the population who are not optimistic enough. You're talking down your country, blah, blah, blah. As the leadership, they get a bit of a pass. They can, fuck things up for 4 years and,
yeah, I love this.
Yeah.
I love this. First of all, little diversion. I think how we define leadership is probably where the problem comes from. I think we have this impression that elected leaders are leadership and the rest of us are followers. Right? And that's a huge, huge misconception. Once we expand the definition of leadership, and whether we're talking about leadership in the home or we're talking about leadership in communities or in churches and mosques, whether it's leadership in a place of work, right? You then realize that when we say leadership, we're saying that anyone that is in a position to take a decision that will affect our outcome is at that point a leader. And so that definition changes, right? But the other way to also think that through is that the person that is most impacted by a situation is the one that ought to be most motivated to change it. Mm-hmm. The one that benefits from the situation has zero motivation to change it. So the power to create change lies with the people that are most impacted. Why would someone who is benefiting from a broken system wake up in the morning and want to do something about it? Right? If someone has no real motivation to make a change, why should I rely on the person to be responsible for the change? I hold the personal view, and there's a quote that fed into this that says that the only corner of the world you can change is your corner. It's still the same thing with the citizen. There's something that will trigger a change at the presidency start with the citizen. Must necessarily start with the citizen. Right? If you've got a good president in play, it started with citizens. If a bad president is still in play, it has to change the trigger, the anchor, the lever lies with people. It has to lie with people. So I don't know that it's a philosophical disagreement as per se. I think when you think about it in practical and pragmatic terms, like where can change come from?
Mm.
I'm of the view that you can only come from the people, even when it's expressed through a leader, right? Once you have a leader who is driving change, the people have done something that have ended up with that leader in play. That's the first part of it. A bit on optimism. Does confidence have an economic value?
Absolutely.
Does self-belief have a value?
Absolutely.
Why do we market things? Do we always place a narrative around the product that we sell that is superior to the product itself? That's a constant, right? Every single thing that we want people to connect with and buy and engage with, we present it in its best possible way, what we call our Sunday best. The same thing with our communities, our ethnicity, our religion. Nobody goes and talk about the aspect of their conviction that may be debatable. We talk about the best part of it, right? That is applicable to a nation. You've got to sell your country. If you take the most powerful country in the world today, very few people know that over 20% of the prison population in the world is in the United States of America.
Okay.
Nobody wants to talk about that. That's not what defines America, right? Or the gun violence, right? Or the number of people that are disenfranchised. There's a lot of things that the United States of America will never, ever, ever make the topic of the day. But they will do everything possible to talk about what makes America great.
So, right, so I'm with you.
So when we say that, how you position your country, how you present your country affects how people relate with your country. Irrespective of what else your leader may or may not be doing. This is an independent fact. If I'm having a conversation about Nigeria and I want someone to come and visit Nigeria, I want to have a conversation about Dirty December. I want to have a conversation about the great cultural destinations in Nigeria. I want to have a conversation about how Nigeria started from a pure dictatorship in 1999 and has advanced and have had multiple elections. I talk about the thing because I'm selling something, right? It doesn't mean that there are aspects of the product, like they say side effects. Like every product has got side effects or possible side effects. That's not what I'm selling. There'll be a fine print where I'll say possible side effect might be that the policeman may stop you on the way and ask you for $1. Like that's side effects. That's the conversation we're having here, especially if a country is in a phase where I think this is the early phase of development. Think about this as the people who are cutting down the bushes for the first time and felling the trees and starting the homestead. They're not going to look at it, oh wow, this is the middle of a bush, I can't do anything here. They're going to think, oh wow, imagine what I could do here. It's a mental state. If you take it that, again, if I go back to where the conversation started, if you expect this country to do A, B, C, D for you already, then when you don't get A, B, C, you're going to be very upset.
Precisely.
When you understand that this country has not yet been told to do ABC, you're going to ask yourself, do I want those that will come after me to be able to access ABC? If the answer is yes, roll up your sleeves. And that rolling up your sleeves include, for instance, recognizing and taking responsibility for a leadership that has failed to deliver. And that's why I say things like you've got to have mandatory voting, everybody's got to participate, because it is still the power lies with the people. The benefit lies with the people. The consequences or the cost of all the bad governance is affecting the people. So change can only happen from the people. I don't see why someone who is competent and capable could not have competed on, if the circumstances were fair, who has now turned out at the top for any number of reasons, including the fact that the people did not participate enough. For any number of reasons, is now at the top. Why should I rely on that person to change the system?
So I'm with you, but I think where we'll still disagree.
And what is the commercial value of blames? What do I get when I finish the blaming? Let's have an organized blaming session of blaming the leader. And we'll come together and we articulate our blame. And you are right, they did this, they failed to do that. When we finish, what do we have? What is the product?
Why does it have? Why should there be a product?
When you are in a desperate situation, every energy, when you apply your energy in a crisis, your energy must deliver an output. Otherwise, you are stuck in a crisis.
So, like you said, if you're selling something and your consumer is dissatisfied with your product and you give it a bad review, they don't necessarily have to get something.
But see, so you've taken the benefit, taking the position of a consumer.
Yeah. So I guess
of someone who can walk away.
So I guess
a product can walk away.
So I guess
you are a producer.
So I get where you're coming from. So like there's you, Abubakar Suleiman, the business owner, the business leader, right? And for you in that particular role, and are highly important. I mean, who would come to invest if everything we talk about is the bad story, the bad stuff, the blame game, blah blah blah? I get it. There is you, Abubakar Suleiman, the citizen, and that right. So what I'm saying is that the journey from you understanding your role as a citizen, as a stakeholder, or citizen as a bystander is not, we assume it, but it's not automatic.
Oh no, I don't assume it's automatic, and it's the reason why I argue for it. If I assume it's automatic, I'll have no case to make, right?
So because even for the countries you start, the United States, for example, there are hundreds, possibly thousands of intermediaries who tell these stories, even beyond the citizens.
Yes.
Because these intermediaries are the ones that ensure customer satisfaction. If we put it,
let me push back a bit on this.
Okay.
Let me push back a bit on this. First and foremost, I don't assume anything. I don't assume that everybody is in a particular state.
Yeah.
But I insist that people need to be in that state.
Yeah.
Even as an individual, as a citizen, the reason why I get up in the morning with a bit of spring in my step is because I believe that I'm going to be able to, latch onto the little good that is there and make it bigger.
Okay.
If you take that away from me, why should I get up in the morning? Why should I feel that energy? Why should I do, right? So whether as a business or as an individual, it's important that I have hope. Hope is the only thing that keeps us going. Yeah. What I'm saying is that don't sell me hopelessness. That's number one. And hopelessness is something like saying, oh, they are the leaders. Throw a hand up in the air and say the leaders are the one who can change it. That's hopelessness, because it means that all I can do is sit and wait for the leaders to act. I believe in selling action. I believe in saying to every individual that there is something you can do right now that will make your circumstances better. And that should be your focus. Because if you did that by 100 million people, it's a movement. It's a positive movement. It's a conviction. Look, when we talk about the Asian economies and how they became what they became, at the bottom of it is a lot of individual discipline at the family level. These people work hard. Government didn't tell them to work hard. Every family did everything possible to make sure that they got the best possible education. The parents worked really hard, even before the economy existed or was built for them to be able to prosper.
That's why did not happen? It certainly didn't come from you wake up in the morning and every individual also just decide to be this way.
No,
right?
It came from
the people being able to take those actions or have that belief around the vision or something.
Whatever we call it a culture.
Yeah.
And the way culture happens is it starts with a few people, right? And then there's evidence that that culture yields or delivers a better outcome. And then other people start to replicate it. But the culture also needs to have advocates. There are people who speak on behalf of that movement, right? Yeah. What we have is a situation where we're being told that because you see what is possible, right? Because you live it, is because you are excusing those who are failing. No, you are taking responsibility for the things that you can control, either in your personal space in your life or in your business or in your community, and saying the story I want to hear when I wake up in the morning is the story of possibilities of the things we're doing, not the story of failure of the things that they are doing that I can't do anything about. Let me just again repeat this. We will never excuse incompetent or corrupt government.
Absolutely.
But we will ignore them. We will ignore them when we don't have the lever to change them. We'll either change them or we ignore them. But we cannot sit back, look at them, have no power to make any change, and think that it is a very positive outcome to speak about them to ourselves. Because ultimately, we don't even speak to them. We don't speak truth to power. You don't go on social media and speak truth to power. If you think that the power that be in Nigeria is sitting someone on social media waiting to be told what you have to say, you've already missed the point. Those who speak truth to power use the processes that compel power to listen. And those processes sometimes include using the legal process, include using the political process. But any other thing is, to my mind, people are just finding reasons, really, not to focus their attention on the thing that will move the needle. Because that then is sacrifice. So no, I don't disagree that leaders have a responsibility, but when they fail, you either change them, meaning that you work with them so that they become different, or you change them, meaning you replace them. If you're not doing any of those two, then go back and do what you can do to make a change in your society. So we are alive.
It's a pleasure. Final question. Were you honest?
Absolutely honest.